So we just had some stimulating discussion, but I forgot to turn it on. So Grayson and Chase, sorry. But we're talking about Constitution. Now, the balance of power. This was to make sure that Congress had the same number of slave and free states. Why was that so important?
So one couldn't overthrow the other.
So then, if you had more free states, then the slave states would be worried that what?
That was illegal.
They were going to pass a law in Congress to outlaw slavery. But if you had more slave states, then the free states would be worried about what? Julie. So slavery could come into these free states. So keeping the same number of states means you'd have the same number of representatives to vote, because every state has 2 houses, right? What are the 2 houses of our Congress? Joey? Those are 2 parties. What are the 2 houses of Congress? The Senate and the House of Representatives. Which one is equal? In other words, you have the same number in every state.
House of Representatives?
No. House of Representatives you have based on your what? Population. So the Senate, you have 2 in every state. That's why it was so important, because to get a law passed, it has to go through both houses. So if they decide to pass a law against slavery, it would have to go through the House and also through the Senate and be approved in both. If it wasn't, it wouldn't become a law. Does that make sense? Or people just locked into copying notes? When can you copy these notes? You should get as much as you want, but you should be paying attention, adding your own notes. So here we had the problem. They had to have a compromise over the first issue of tariff. Henry Clay is called the Great Compromiser. Why is he called that? Remember this word? What's this word? What's this word mean? Compromise, what's that word mean?
So like, kind of like splitting everything evenly, so it's like fair for everyone.
So everybody has to give a little bit. Each side has to give it a little bit to reach an agreement. So the first one was called the Missouri Compromise, or the Compromise of 1820. Because if Missouri applied for statehood, they wanted to be a slave state. What would that do? Ben?
It would overthrow the balance of power.
Okay, it would mess up this balance of power. There'd be more slave states than free. So the Northerners didn't want to let Missouri get into the country. So they worked out a compromise. So when Missouri came in, then Maine also came in at the same time as a what? Free state. So that kept the balance of power the same. But the other thing it did, okay, everything north of 36 degrees 30 minutes in the Louisiana Territory would be free. What's 36 degrees 30 minutes? Joey? Which one? What? It's one of these lines. What are these lines called?
Longitude?
This is longitude. So it's a line of latitude. So 36 degrees, 30 minutes, and the Louisiana Territory was supposed to be free. So, this favors who? This favors who?
So,
The south.
South, slave states. Who's this favor?
North.
The North. Who's this favor?
the Free States.
If everything north of this was gonna be free, who does that favor?
North.
Favors the North, right? So the North got two things, the South got what? One thing. What's the next compromise? Okay? Next compromise was a tariff in 1833. View the whole screen. Full screen. So, high tariff. Again, the South threatened the doctrine of nullification, saying that what? What's this mean? If they threaten this?
If they pass this law, they're gonna ignore it.
We're gonna ignore it, we're not gonna listen to it. Again, if they did that, we'd be returning to the Articles. So a compromise was worked out. They're gonna start with a high tariff, and then it's gonna gradually go down. But they're still not dealing with the issues, are they? They're just what? They're just compromising on it. So each side can give in a little bit. Then in 1850, California asked to come in. Okay? California asked to come in. What was going to happen? How could they come in 1850? California, I mean, they're way over here. All these other states are just coming in here. How did California come in so fast?
The gold rush.
Because of the gold rush. All the people that came out there. So they asked to become a state in 1850, but that was going to do what?
Overthrow it.
That would upset the balance of power again. You're going to have more what? More free states. Now the other issue they had was that what about these other new territories here that are eventually going to what? Become states. Are they going to be slave? Are they going to be free? That had to be dealt with, okay? Another issue they had was fugitive slave laws. What's a fugitive slave?
An escaped slave.
So somebody that ran away from slavery. A fugitive slave law means if somebody ran away from slavery, a southerner should be able to what? To get them back. And there should be a law that punishes the people that what? That help them get free. And if they're holding them free in the North, so they wanted, the South wanted this. Texas boundaries, they wanted to readjust them. Okay? This is what Texas looked like after. Right? We saw what Texas looked like before, right? This is what Texas looks like before. Okay? So they wanted to adjust these boundaries. Okay? And the fifth had to do with the South's status. In other words, this has to do with whether or not they can do the doctrine of nullification. So here's what the results were. Those were the issues they had to deal with. This is what happened. California was admitted free. New Mexico and Utah were based on popular sovereignty. The slave trade was abolished in the District of Columbia. There was a stricter fugitive slave law, and the Texas boundaries were reduced, like we saw here. Okay? So let's look at this and see who benefited. California was admitted free. Who benefits there?
North.
The North benefits there. New Mexico and Utah were based on popular sovereignty. What's popular sovereignty mean? Who remembers that? What's popular sovereignty mean?
Where the people get to choose.
So the people are going to vote whether they want slavery or not in those territories. So who's that favor?
Both.
Okay, we'll put both here with a question mark. We're going to come back to that. Slave trade was abolished in the District of Columbia.
North.
Wasn't slave trade abolished way before this anyway? Could you import slaves from Africa? That ended in like in 1808 or something. This is what year?
1850.
This is 1850. So what's the slave trade they're talking about? What's the slave trade they're talking about? How can you have slave trade if they ended importing Africans in 1808?
Between the states.
Okay? Remember, slaves were treated kind of like cattle. So, slaves are expensive. If I went to buy a slave, it costs like $1,000 for a good slave hand. And $1,000 back then is what?
Like around
Okay.
10,000 today.
So a person isn't going to spend $1,000 unless what? They think it's going to make them lots of money. So they might buy a male slave and a female slave. Why?
To make babies.
So they'll have babies. And the babies will become what? Slaves. And if you have too many slaves, just like if you have too many cattle, what do?
They kill
They don't kill them. What do? They sell them. Sell them off. Where do you sell them? At the auction. So there were slave auctions happening within the country with the slaves that were already here and slaves that were being born to slaves. So that's why the North was upset, because there was actually an auction place in our nation's capital where they were selling slaves back and forth. Because our nation's capital is where?
Washington, D.C.
Right here, Washington, D.C., which is in Maryland. At that time, Maryland was a slave state. So it's surrounded by, really, Washington would be in which region of the country?
North.
Really, it's officially would be in the South. Okay? So who does that favor?
So,
Having that abolished favors the North, okay? Stricter fugitive slave law. That favors who?
So,
South. Texas boundaries being reduced. Who does that favor? How does that favor the North?
It favors Mexico.
They didn't reduce the boundaries of Mexico, they reduced the boundaries where?
Of Texas.
Look where Texas was. See, look at Texas. Here's the Rio Grande, okay? Here's where it was. Here's the Rio Grande. That didn't change. What changed?
all the top part.
All this part. Okay? So we'll go back to where it was, okay? This is what it is. This is where it was.
Oh, that favors the
Okay.
South because it's not close.
Who does it favor?
The South.
this is kind of hard to think about. Okay? It does favor the North, but why?
Why do I?
If the state is smaller, they have less representatives.
So if you have fewer territory, you're gonna have fewer people. If you have fewer people, you're not gonna have as many people in the House of Representatives. That means these states, which became, okay, these territories, would help decide, okay, the power in Congress. Let's go back to this one that says both. This is based on popular sovereignty. What's it like in New Mexico and Utah?
Mountain.
Hot and deserty. Is it good cotton growing land?
No.
Is it good tobacco growing land? No. So chances are the people there are what?
Free.
Are they gonna vote for slavery?
No.
They're not gonna vote for something that isn't profitable. So this ends up favoring who? North. So out of this compromise, who's getting the best? North. So if I'm a Southerner, I'm starting to see this and say, well, they compromised, we worked it out here, but what? In the back of your mind, you're thinking what?
That's really bad.
This is not really fair. They're starting to gang up on us. They're gonna try to take our way of life away. Then you see in your sheet, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That's right here, okay? Kansas and Nebraska. Kansas wants to become a state. And it's supposed to be based on popular sovereignty, but according to the Compromise of 1820, what? Here's 36 degrees 30 minutes right here. So if Kansas comes in according to that compromise, what?
They have to be a free state.
It's supposed to be free. But that compromise was declared unconstitutional by this Dred Scott decision. We learned about Dred Scott last year, right? Who was he?
Yeah, oh, yeah. Wasn't he like a slave man at work and got, freedom for his wife and kids?
Well, his wife and kids eventually got freedom, but he was a slave that came where?
To the north.
Came to Minnesota. And then he went and they sued, saying what?
He's a fugitive.
If I'm in free country, I should be what? Free. And it went through all the courts, went all the way to our highest court. What's our highest court? Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in 1857. You know what they ruled?
No.
He would be freed.
Slaves are property. He wasn't given his freedom. So in 1857, our Supreme Court, you know why it ruled that way? Because most of the justices on the Supreme Court were from where? They were from the South. Like currently, we have a Supreme Court justice being nominated, going through the process. Who is that? Guys paying attention to the news?
No.
You should be, because it's important to us as Catholics.
Amy Coney Barrett.
Okay? Amy Coney Barrett, who has a very personal stance on what? That should make Catholics be concerned about.
Abortion.
Abortion. Right now, the Supreme Court ruled in 1973 that abortions are what?
Okay.
Okay, all the way to the birth. This is what's ridiculous about our nation right now, is If a baby is born and you kill it, that's what?
Okay.
Murder. If the baby's inside the womb and you kill it,
It's.
that's okay. But see, in 1857, they ruled that slaves are what?
Property.
Are property. They're just like cattle.
Wow.
Our highest court said that. Okay, that shows you that our highest court can be what?
Bad.
Wrong. Okay, bad. So what it did, since they said that, is that throughout the Missouri Compromise, they said that that is unconstitutional. They didn't have a right to make that law. Congress didn't have the power. They said it wasn't in the Constitution. And so then what happened in Kansas became known as the prelude to the Civil War. What's a prelude? How many band people do we have?
Me.
What's a prelude? So, if you've ever been to a musical over at the high school,
Yeah.
the band usually, before the musical starts, what do? The band plays a prelude. You know what the prelude is? Parts of all the songs that are going to be in the musical.
Oh, yeah.
Okay?
I guess that's.
So a prelude is like a picture of what's going to happen.
Ah.
So when they say Kansas, on your sheets it says bleeding Kansas. You can put was a prelude to the Civil War. In other words, everything that went on in the Civil War, what?
Wasn't it
Went on in Kansas. But it went on in Kansas in 1854. Here's what happened. Slave forces came over from Missouri because they wanted to have a constitution in Kansas that was what? Slave forces came from Missouri. They wanted a constitution that was what?
For them.
For them, had slavery in it. Okay? Non-slave forces, what's the term for people that don't want slavery? Abolitionists. Abolitionists wanted to have a constitution that was what? Free. Because no longer does this have to be free because they threw that out. Now it's based on popular sovereignty, so the citizens of Kansas are going to decide. The problem was, the people coming in weren't necessarily citizens of Kansas. They were meeting and coming in from neighboring states. So you know the conflict we're having today between Democrats and Republicans, we had conflict, we've always had conflict in American history. This is another example of it, but this one was bloody. So they burned cities, there's fighting, bloodshed. That's why Kansas has been called Bleeding Kansas.
That sounds fun.
But you notice, that was what year? 1854. They didn't. That doesn't lead us right into the Civil War, because when does the Civil War start?
When Abraham Lincoln was elected.
Okay? So the minute he was elected president, these states in the dark pink here secede. What's that mean? What's secede mean?
They leave.
Say withdraw from the Union. So that's just saying what? What are they saying?
Or slave states.
We are not part of the United States. we're gonna be our own country.
Wow.
The reason why is because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. The new party, there's a new party formed, the Republican Party. And part of their platform, what's a platform? Remember, what's a platform? Those are your goals. One of their goals was, we're going to stop the spread of slavery. It's very important here you understand, they didn't say we're gonna stop what? Slavery. They said we're gonna stop the spread of slavery. What does that mean?
Make sure it didn't go into any.
So all these new territories up here, the Republican Party said what?
Are free.
These are gonna be free. They didn't say that these states would what? Have to be free. But they did say all of these territories would have to be free. But, you know, the southern states already saw the writing up here, you know, these things were favoring who? All these compromises. So they said, okay, we've had it. We'll leave it. Now Lincoln could have done what? He could have done what?
Started a war right there and then.
Well, that's what he did. He could have done what? That's one. So one is go to war. Okay?
Stop slavery.
So you have to force them. You have to force them to come back into the Union. That's what he chose. But he could have what?
Not chosen
How?
by not choosing.
He could have said, okay. You guys can what?
Be your own country.
You could be your own country. So we could be two countries today.
Whoa.
We'd be the United States, and what's the other country?
Alabama.
What do they call this country?
Confederation.
Back to our original, they were called the Confederacy. But again, a confederacy just means who has the power. In a confederacy, the Articles of Confederation or a confederacy, who has the power?
The federal government.
Who has sovereignty in a confederation? Who has all the power?
People.
The states.
The states. Yeah.
So it's like Texas is their own country, Mississippi's their own country, Louisiana's their own country, except they agreed to join together. That's what our first government was. All these original 13 colonies were states that had their supreme power, but they just agreed to work together. And we know from history, our first government, how good was it? It wasn't good. It was weak. So the Confederacy is going to be the same thing. He could have did the same thing Great Britain did in the Revolutionary War. He could have said what?
Sure, you can go and be your own country.
Be your own country, and we'll just wait. And you'll do what?
I'm running back.
You'll come running back to us. And by doing that, he could have what? Avoided all this bloodshed. Although today we probably what? We might be two nations today. And slavery probably what? Would still be existing, or probably wouldn't still exist, but it would have taken a lot more. So some people mistakenly say Lincoln's reason for fighting the Civil War was to end slavery. That's a mistake. What was his reason for fighting the Civil War? To keep our country united. To preserve our union of states. That's why we went to war. We didn't go to war to end slavery. We went to war to preserve the Union. And what's so bad about Civil War?
People died.
It was super bloody.
Civil wars are terribly bloody. Remember what we talked about in the Revolutionary War, the techniques of fighting? Remember how you fight? You know, you line up from each other and you what? Shoot at each other? Well, by now, technology, the guns are what?
Better.
Much more accurate and effective. That means you have a lot more what? Casualties and deaths. The other problem with the Civil War? How many have relatives, so today, how many have relatives that would be in these states? In the pink,
Oh, in the pink.
okay?
Colorado.
Any of the pink. If you have relatives in any of the pink, that means what? If this was 1861, April of 1861, that means what?
They would be.
If I joined the military, I'd be shooting what?
Family.
I'd be shooting my relatives. There were people that were on these border states. You see these light green states? These light green states are actually slave states that stayed in the Union. They did not withdraw. But you had people in these states that favored the Southern cause. So within your family, you might have a brother that agreed with the North and you agreed with the South. So this brother went to fight for the Union Army and you went and fought for the Confederate Army. So you could be shooting at your brother or your cousin or your father, which happened, okay? So this is the date you need to remember, 1861, that's when the Civil War began. Here's what happened. The southern states had all these forts that were federal forts, but they were in the southern states, so the southern states said what? There are forts. And a lot of the federal officials just relinquished the forts, but this guy at Charleston, at Fort Sumter, outside Charleston, said no. And so the Southerners began to fire on Fort Sumter. And they ran out of ammunition and supplies, so the general at Fort Sumter had to what?
Surrender.
He had to surrender. But that marks the first action fought in the Civil War, even though it wasn't really soldiers fighting soldiers, it was just defending a fort. That this marks the beginning of the Civil War. So you have two countries now, although Lincoln wouldn't recognize this, so he would never say the Confederate States of the, because he would call these states what? He wouldn't call them the Confederacy. What would Lincoln call them?
Rebels?
States in rebellion. Okay? So we have two sides. We have the Union. Sometimes it's called the Battle of the Blue and the Gray too. So you have the Union. What color are their uniforms? Blue. And they were given a nickname. What are they called?
Yankees.
Yankees. And on the other side, you have the Confederacy. color of their uniforms?
Red.
Gray.
Right.
What are they called? Rebels. Who's the leader here?
Abraham Lincoln.
So Lincoln is the leader here. Who's the leader over here? On the board? Jefferson Davis. So, just like in every war, there are pluses and advantages. What's the advantage the Union has? We went over this last year. I think, didn't we have an activity you had to do? Last year?
Seems like I remember that. My memory's getting blurred.
I mean, earlier this year, we did the,
One of our distance learning lessons last year, you had to put advantages and disadvantages, if I remember right.
Yeah.
So what's the advantage the Union had? This is very similar to Great Britain and the colonies. In fact, when I give this essay question on the test, students tend to mix them up. Don't mix them up even though they're similar. What is the advantage that the Union has? Because England's advantages were very similar, almost the same. So the Union had more supplies. Why? Why does the Union have more supplies? Ewan.
Because they had the factories to make.
Because they had all the factories making the supplies. What else do they have? They had more money. They had bigger population. They have a well-trained army and navy. What's their disadvantage?
A lot of their leaders were old and cautious.
Well, part of it had to do with the leaders. Lincoln's biggest problem we're going to see, we'll watch a video on it. Lincoln replaced the general in charge of Union troops like 4 or 5 times until he finally settled on who? Who's the famous Union general?
Ulysses S. Grant.
Ulysses S. Grant. So he replaced all these generals all the time because they would get an advantage, a general would get an advantage and they wouldn't pursue. You have to understand, so many of the generals went to the same class in the Army. What's the Army training place called? Their school.
Boot camp.
Well, at boot camp, but the school, if you become an officer, where do you go? It's hard to get into this school today.
Yale?
West Point. West Point is the college to prepare generals. Okay? Many of the Civil War generals went to West Point. For both sides. That means you were fighting who? One of your classmates.
That sounds fun.
Now you had an advantage, so a Union general had an advantage, and rather pursue and finish them off, he what?
Waited.
He waited or let him go. And so that ends up prolonging the war, really, till Lincoln found, Ulysses S. Grant was known as the Butcher. He got the nickname the Butcher
Oh,
because his casualties under his were so high.
5
Because he would never what?
He would never step down, he would just throw his troops at the enemy.
Yeah, he would never back out, okay? So Lincoln said, I can't, they said, well, you need to get rid of him, too many people are dying. He said, I can't get rid of him, he's the only one that fights. Okay? So that's the problem with the leaders, wasn't that they were bad leaders, really is more or less the psychology of it. Okay? The biggest part, though, here is the same thing that Britain had. They were fighting an offensive war. What's the disadvantage of fighting an offensive war?
Not knowing the area.
You don't know the land. Okay? What's the other disadvantage? Joey.
Usually longer supply things.
So you have longer supply lines. What other disadvantage?
You had to keep the land and then
So you have to take and hold it. So with this, we should probably just say the psychology is one disadvantage. Because we weren't created to shoot at our friends. Okay? So, all the advantages over here become what? Disadvantages over there. So, fewer supplies, less money, less population, weak army, weak navy. One other plus over here that the South had is this. Cavalry. What's the cavalry mean?
Horseback.
Okay, fighting on horses. Why would they have an advantage there? Why would the South have an advantage there? Because most of the people in the South were what? They grew up on these plantations that had horses. So they were good with horses. Does anybody have a question on the first 2 pages that I can answer right now that you didn't know? It's due on the next time, the first 2 pages of the review. All those answers are on your notes, so if you have a question, come and ask me and I'll point you where to go in the notes.
The purpose for
Need
France.
the sheet here, huh? You guys can go line up on the wall out there.
That's why I have such a bad grade. And I was wondering if I could retake
You can't retake your religion. You always do your service project. There's 100 points for that. So if you do your service project, it would bump your grade way up. The other, for social studies, I gave you guys the option when I passed them back. I said you guys can make corrections, but you didn't do that. If you make corrections, I will look at it again on the quiz.